We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts without...
I'm Paul Dockery, a Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light and an energy enthusiast.
I'm Dr. Ahlmahz Negash, a Principal Resource Planning Analyst for Tacoma Power, an energy systems researcher, and of course, an energy justice enthusiast.
And I'm Dr. Farhad Billimoria, a Director in the Electricity Markets Group for S&P Global and a Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
I'm not going to let that pass by. I heard the doctor this time, Farhad. Did you get awarded, or whatever the term is? What's the term, and did you get it?
Yeah. So it's I've still got to have my official graduation, but it's all done and dusted, which is good.
That is, congratulations.
Right.
I've had doctor in brackets because I wasn't sure when you were going to elevate to your doctorate of philosophy in energy systems. What is the doctorate in?
In engineering.
Engineering, even better, from Oxford. Yeah, very excited. Well, Conley sent us a note earlier today letting us know she couldn't make today's recording because she's under the weather and encouraging us to proceed without her. We wish her a quick and full recovery. On Public Power Underground, we talk about the energy enthusiasm trifecta of electrification, markets, and people. On today's episode, we're discussing the wonky topic of governance of regional transmission organizations. And we're going to do that with an interview with Ari Peskoe, the Director of Electricity Law Initiatives at Harvard Law School. I sometimes wonder if Ari is the chief wonk of energy Twitter. What do you think, Farhad? Is that like his kind of unofficial title?
I think he'd be pretty close. And judging from the discussion and the papers that he writes, it's really, 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 really deep. I mean, it's like, subterranean. So I always enjoy it, though I have to really do some work to actually understand what he's talking about sometimes, because it's so knowledgeable and deep about the US in particular. So
yes, it is. And that was his advice, right? Ahlmahz, to go deep.
That is exactly what he said. I thought that I think you asked him initially, so we're all electric utility enthusiasts, and you asked him if he was an electric utility skeptic. Is that what it was?
That's what I asked him.
That was it was healthy skepticism, and I appreciate it. But like Farhad, I learned a ton.
Well, good. Very wonky, hopefully also informative, at least it was for Ahlmahz, and I am very excited about it. But he does go deep, and I thought to start off today's episode, we do a recurring segment, 30 Seconds of Theory, to kind of make sure some of that deep analysis can get level set up to a theoretic foundation or, theoretic level. And I'm going to start with you, Farhad, for 30 Seconds of Theory. Cost of service versus incentive regulation, the different frameworks of regulation. Take it away.
So hopefully I can get it done in 30 seconds. But essentially what we're talking about here is, how do you actually regulate what a monopoly can earn? Or how does a monopoly make money? And we've taken a decision at a higher level that we're not going to open up what used to be a competitive space. But once these networks have developed, we said, okay, well, let's actually give someone a license or a monopoly to operate in a particular area. How do they, if that's what we're giving them, that's a pretty big right. How do we regulate how much they get paid? And the way that it tends to be done traditionally, and that underpins a lot of what FERC's design of regulation is what's called cost of service regulation. So where the regulator determines the total revenue requirement for the utility, and that really comprises a review of what the costs of capital are and the costs on capital. So cost of capital would be like the rate of returns that investors need, both debt and equity investors. And then costs on capital include things like capital expenditure, operating expenditure, et cetera, to essentially build up basically from zero all the way to what a utility, a fair and it's different across the world, but everyone has different sort of prudence or fairness standards. What would be fair for a utility to recover? Now, the challenge with that is that that actually doesn't create much in the way of incentives to do better. And over time, what's evolved is a complementary, as Paul Joskow calls it, complementary stream called incentive regulation, which creates in certain types of incentives for utilities based on a baseline to do better than what would be expected, or to do better than what would be a sort of a good return, where they might get to keep some of the upside, but they would also share the downside if they don't meet that return.
And that is incentive regulation. And this is Joskow. You want to reference us to a paper I can put in the show notes?
I will. I'll put it in the show notes. It's a paper called The Expansion of Incentive Performance-Based Regulation of Electricity Distribution and Transmission in the United States. Just got published from a CPER MIT working paper. A great paper, because it just goes into the history and the background as well. So if anyone wants to get great citations to classical theories and classical papers, there's stuff in there, but it also talks about what the current state of play in the US is. So I really enjoyed that one.
Perfect. Sarah in post, give me like one of those good dings, that like correct ding. Next up, we're going to 30 seconds of theory, Ahlmahz, from you on procedural justice. Ari and I spent a lot of time on governance and why governance matters. And I think there's a great link here to prior conversations we had about energy justice. And if you could link those up through this procedural justice framework. Take it away.
Exactly. So I'm going to try to keep it in 30 seconds. So procedural justice is a tenet of energy justice. And it ties in very nicely to this topic where we're talking about stakeholders and being able to participate in very transparent processes. So procedural justice is essentially at its core fairness in process, which includes transparency in our actions. It includes allowing stakeholders to actually have a voice in that process, but also that the decision-making, there's a potential for those voices to influence decision-making. So a very wrong way of thinking about procedural justice is that you just invite people to watch you do what you're already going to do. True procedural justice is being transparent, allowing people to have a voice, and allowing that voice to influence your process. I think that might have been 30 seconds.
Sarah, give us another ding, a correct ding. Ding!
I'll just cheat and add, like, it is so important for that to be a part of transmission, because transmission, I'll just leave it at that. It is incredibly important in transmission.
Perfect. Well, the three tenets of energy justice being distributional, recognitional, and procedural justice were articulated in a paper called Energy Justice, a conceptual review by Jenkins et al. That's Kirsty Jenkins and some co-authors. I will have a link for that in the show notes as well. But with that foundation, are we ready? Do we think we're ready for this wonky and deep conversation, folks?
Absolutely.
Can't wait.
We're taking a quick break from a word for our sponsor, and then a wonky discussion of regional transmission organization governments with an electric utility critic.
This Public Power Underground is sponsored by Renewable Northwest. Renewable Northwest is a regional renewable energy advocacy organization with a unique and powerful coalition of members that include renewable energy developers, energy buyers and marketers, ratepayer advocates, and environmental NGOs. At our core, we're a bunch of wonky energy nerds working with other energy nerds to build a clean, reliable energy future in the Pacific Northwest. Learn more about Renewable Northwest at renewablenw.org.
This week, I interviewed Ari Peskoe, a self-described electric utility critic and the director of Electric Law Initiative at the Harvard Law School Environmental and Energy Law program. He is a prolific writer about regulation of the U.S. power sector on issues ranging from constitutional challenges to states' energy laws to interstate transmission development. The interview discussed primarily a 2023 Energy Law Journal article he wrote titled, quote, "Replacing the Utility Transmission Syndicate's Control," unquote, where he, quote, argues that RTO governance is now holding the industry back for the benefit of last century's power players. The interview was recorded before the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo and Relentless Inc. versus Department of Commerce, which overturned Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, the longstanding precedent that courts provide deference to an agency's interpretation of ambiguous federal statutes. I think he would have a lot to say on that, but we do not touch on it, so don't want to oversell what you're about to listen to. Prior to the environmental and energy law program, Ari was an associate at a law firm in Washington, D.C., where he litigated before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission about the Western energy crisis. He received his JD from Harvard Law School and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with degrees in electrical engineering and business. Hi, Ari. Welcome to Public Power Underground.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm excited that you agreed to this. We love our wonky energy topics, and I feel like you fit that niche really well.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to wonk out every once in a while, or just as a living, maybe?
Yes, that's exactly right. So this season, we're trying to seek out some diverse perspectives in the energy industry to provide some insights into areas of enthusiasm that may sometimes get lost in abstraction by policymakers or researchers. And you're a diverse perspective from my perspective, because I'm an electric utility enthusiast. This podcast is branded for electric utility enthusiasts. And I feel as though maybe you're an electric utility skeptic. Do I have that right?
I think that's fair, at least a critic for sure.
Critic for sure.
And certainly I focus my work on the investor-owned utilities. So those are the institutions that I follow very carefully through their advocacy at FERC and public utility commissions and courts. I mean, I kind of really, I'm a lawyer, and so I pay careful attention to what the utility lawyers are arguing and what the implications of those arguments are.
Well, I am not an electric utility apologist. I am not, or an investor-owned utility apologist. I just feel as though they are critical institutions for meeting our desire to electrify end uses for the energy transition. You mentioned being an investor-owned utility critic. What about regional transmission organizations? Where in the mix are you an enthusiast? Are you a critic? Are you both for regional transmission organizations?
I really like the theory of RTOs, the idea that we have an entity that has no direct commercial interests in who makes money, who loses money, what technologies are used, and that we have sort of a technocracy running it all, is, I think, an ideal scenario. What I'm critical of is in practice how decision-making happens, and the role particularly that the incumbent utilities and other incumbent players that have been there since these institutions were first founded still seem to have all the seats at the table, or most of the seats at the table. And so I'm concerned that we're creating stagnant organizations that are not going to keep up with the innovation that we need.
And I will say stagnation is one of my concerns amongst these institutions that are the incumbency advantage, the embedded incentives to kind of maintain status quo is a concern. We frequently talk on the podcast about how a lot of our institutions are built for going slow and saying no, that a lot of our regulatory structures were built in like the 70s and 80s when there was backlash against investment in large central power plants. In the Northwest, we had whoops, and we still have a lot of like emotional trauma from a lot of our leadership about whoops, which I don't know the letters for it. Maybe you can explain whoops in a way that I better than me.
No, you probably know the history on this better than I do, so I shouldn't try to get into it. But it just seems like it's one of the many episodes around the country that I think shook the faith in the electric utility industry, but it wasn't just canceled nuclear projects that were problematic back in the 70s. It was a range of factors that the industry just wasn't prepared to meet. And I think we're at a time now where there's just a lot of change happening all at once, whether it's new generation technologies, need to connect across systems, potential for demand growth, growth of distributed energy resources, needing to have cleaner generation. Again, so I think we're at this moment sort of potential crisis for the industry, and are we just going to keep the same players having, steering the ship, or do we want to try to provide more space for competition, for new entities like RTOs to coordinate all these activities? I think those are sort of the questions that I'm interested in.
And I have heard you articulate the desire of how you need to modernize your governance structures for these institutions in order to enable innovation. And I've also heard you unpack that some of these incentives are not conducive to efficiency. My bias is towards needing the innovation. And I think we always have to abstract or understand trade-offs. My bias would be I need to lean less into efficiency and more into institutions that can deploy a lot of new infrastructure for our time. What's your take on that? Do I already have you worried that I'm leading another just dumb old utility guy in the halls of a municipally owned utility?
No, not at all. And I would say a couple things in response. One, just on so there's sort of two research projects I did that kind of shaped my view of the investor-owned utilities. The first was something I did about almost 10 years ago now about distributed energy resources. The Edison Electric Institute put out a paper in 2012. They probably regret releasing it publicly, but it basically said distributed energy resources are a threat to our business model. And here are some strategies for basically stopping their proliferation. It was like putting fixed fees on consumer bills. And so we started to see a wave of these proceedings at public utility commissions where that's what utilities were trying to do, increase fixed fees. And they weren't saying it's because we want to stop DERs. They had other reasons for why they tried to justify it. And it just seemed like we had this sort of coordinated strategy across the country, and it was to try to stop innovation. So rather than saying, hey, here's this new technology, let's see what we ought to be doing with it, let's explore, let's have pilot projects, industry loves that, whatever we're going to do about it. But no, it was just like, let's stop it. Consumers want it, let's slow it down. So that was problematic from my perspective. And the second issue that I got into about 5 years ago was transmission development, and that got me into this issue of right of first refusals, where right of first refusal state laws as well as implemented through RTO tariffs, where when the RTO would plan a project, the default way of doing it was just to tell whatever utility sort of had the retail territory where that project traversed, you just say you get to build it automatically. And the real downside of that is that then we're building a system that is designed by the utility industry, because new transmission projects don't drop out of some computer model. It's somebody saying, hey, here's a line we ought to build. And so my point has been, if we want better projects, new ideas, let's have more project developers coming into the space. So getting back to what you were saying about sort of, we need to sort of deploy capital. There's a lot of other companies other than utilities that are willing to put money into this industry. So from my perspective, the key question is sort of who's going to be the entity, at least at the bulk power system, to coordinate that capital deployment and to operate those sorts of assets. And I think the independent governance model of the RTO has the potential to just make sure the consumers are getting the best projects we need. We're getting the most innovative projects. We're deploying the right set of technologies. I mean, they have their own biases as well. They're also sort of little c conservative institutions that are rightly dedicated to reliability, somewhat skeptical, I think, of, untested technologies. That's all appropriate. But again, sort of having this perspective of somebody who doesn't have a financial stake and who's not going to just be beholden, ideally, to a particular business model.
Yeah, and your research has focused in, at least recently, on transmission. And we talk about transmission a lot, and it's twofold. One is transmission operation is the operation effectively of the grid, because as you are computing congestion at constraints on the transmission system. You will then dispatch different generation around that. So operation of the transmission system is in a lot of ways operation of the generation on the grid. And investment in transmission is effectively weighting the die for all the generation within the portfolio about who runs better. So, and for entities like Seattle City Light that has load growth within a constrained region on one side of a mountain and on the other side of a sound, the need for transmission investment to get resources, low cost resources to load is like massive. And I was hoping to kind of get your feedback on like, is that transmission, centrality of transmission for the purpose of operating a grid resonate with you? And can you unpack why you've honed in on transmission so much?
No, I think you articulated it well. It's sort of the strategic heart of the power system. When you control transmission, you get to basically decide who gets to generate power, how much they get to generate, when they get to generate. When you expand the system, you may be unlocking new resources as well as new opportunities for industrial development. I think, what I've tried to do in some of my work is show how the investor-owned utilities have used their control over transmission to control the other segments of the industry. And this is not just, I'm copying sort of from FERC here. I mean, this is sort of the foundational premise of everything that FERC has tried to do in the past 30 years to unlock competition in generation, is to say, well, in order to have competition in generation or in retailing, we need to make sure that the transmission system is sort of fairly accessible to all users, whether that's generators or retailers or somebody else. And because if you without that sort of what FERC calls open access transmission, you had situations where either utilities were sort of, back then it was just utilities, and so there were the investor utilities, and then there were the rural co-ops and the munis, and the investor-owned utilities used their dominance over the high voltage transmission system to basically lock in their muni or co-op customers, prevent them from getting a better deal from some other utility, or just sort of charge unfair. And again, then once you lock them in, you can charge them unfair prices because they have nowhere else to go. So there's a long history of these sorts of allegations, some of which were found to be true by FERC or by courts. And so, yeah, that the controlling transmission is the whole key. And so when I think about the sort of ROFR issue and whether we should have transmission competition, a lot of times this debate is framed around, is this particular project going to be cheaper if it's built by a utility or by someone who's not a utility? I think that is sort of losing the bigger picture here, which is the importance of the utilities owning the system, because then they get to control it. And today that manifests itself in how these RTOs or the non-RTO regions write the rules that determine how the system is operated and how it's expanded. And often ownership is linked to voting rights and control. And so the more, from the utilities perspective, the more players you let in, that dilutes their control over the system's evolution, and their control is really valuable to them.
We're going to get more into the governance and RTO governance and the influence of utilities in that. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on just electric utilities outside of it. One of the you're a recurring contributor to the Clean Law podcast, great podcast for any of our listeners. And you're a better host than me. I'm a little intimidated interviewing you because you're artful and gracious and a very good host.
I appreciate that.
But you were interviewed on an October 31st, 2022 episode. For those, should go back and listen. And you made this comment that stood out to me at the time, which is the optimal solution is for utilities to do less. So insofar as you have a view, not only about the RTO governance and how to disentangle transmission ownership from just incumbent utilities, but for the industry and electric service writ large, do you have a view around public ownership of utilities or retail choice? Do you have a perspective on how electric service is done in your view?
Yes. Well, let me say something. So, I spent a lot of my research is about issue spotting, identifying problems. What's wrong with the current system? And one reason I don't spend as much time trying to conjure up solutions is because I know in the real world, solutions are restricted based on in part what the utility industry wants, because they have so much lobbying power in Congress and at the state. So if you want to imagine some new law to restructure the industry, you have to go somehow through the utility industry. And time again, we see how that's very hard, if not impossible to do. So in my work, really what I push for is how does FERC use its existing legal authority to push that ball forward. I mean, I wish I knew who to attribute this quote to, but the investor-owned utilities are sort of empire builders. They're constantly seeking to expand, and they do that either through sort of mergers, where we just, we see these sort of handful of holding companies keep adding and adding.
It wasn't always this way.
Right.
We had a Public Utility Holding Act that was in place for a vast 50 years of the expansion, and it got revoked. In 2005, it got, anyway, it wasn't always that way.
Yeah, I mean, and so now we have situations like, in PJM, which stretches from Chicago to New Jersey down to North Carolina, most of the transmission is basically owned by 7 giant companies. That's a huge swath of territory to have sort of 7 companies controlling the power system. In New England, I think it was 3, now I think it's 4 when National Grid sold off its Rhode Island holdings, but Rhode Island's pretty small. So, it's kind of like 3 companies here, too, controlling New England in a lot of ways. So, this I think is problematic. And so, when I say they should be doing more, doing less, I like restructuring as sort of theoretical matter that we're going to separate each segment of the industry: distribution, retail, transmission, generation. And then, again, I think, going back to these ROFR laws, let's not have a default rule where the utility just gets to build everything. Let's open this space up more. And I think, utilities always talk about their number one priority is reliability, reliability, reliability. I take their word at it, but so then stop being so devoted to project development. I mean, I don't see how these two are these seem like totally separate skills. Managing the local distribution system versus, say, building a new nuclear power plant, right? If you're like Southern Company. I mean, these are like very different things. And if your whole thing is we want to be focused on reliability, then have an organization that is focused on reliability and not on project development. We have to rethink the business model then. How do we pay for all this? And that's sort of a separate major question that I haven't tried to figure out what the answer is, because again, you're going to run into utility industry opposition the second you're trying to change their business model that they've been so comfortable with for 100 years.
I like the perspective that there's a lot of value in issue spotting and finding where the incentives are misaligned or institutions are pursuing something maybe outside of the public interest. I do, from my perspective, as at a vertically integrated utility that has generation, transmission, and retail service, my perspective tends to be that there's a lot of value in the coherence of planning across those segments. And this will probably get to, and we can start pivoting to regional transmission organizations in this, because I do think there is need, especially as you're expanding a lot of grid infrastructure, a need to have kind of coherent plans for generation, transmission, and electric service, understanding where you expect load to be growing, which can be informed by economic development priorities of local communities, understanding where generation is likely to arise, and that is informed through development practices and understanding the costs of generation resources in different locations, and the planning for transmission that kind of, as I very much agree with you, this is the core infrastructure that kind of makes it all make sense and is like the operating infrastructure for this dynamic.
Yeah, let me briefly just endorse, but also push back what you just said. I agree. Generation and transmission coordination are super important. I've heard a friend of your program, Jacob Mays, talk about this too. So I totally agree that's important. I think the one reason we can't do it right now is because the utilities are, so involved and in some sense control the transmission system and also want to control the generation. And so it's tough to coordinate this in sort of a non-discriminatory way unless you have a really siloed, restructured industry. So I think you can do that coordination in a much better way, and it would help to, again, scale back what the utility is trying to do.
And let's get to that. So part of that will require some reforms for regional transmission organizations and maybe structures and ways to share information and to share systems for planning purposes. You wrote a Energy Law Journal article titled "Replacing the Utility Transmission Syndicate's Control." And before we're going to take a short break because the paper does so much great history about how we got to the governance of regional transmission organizations today. And I wanted to take just a stop at the Western energy crisis of 2000 and 2001 and just ask the leading question. What was the most impactful inflection point in regional transmission ordinance governization, and why was the West Coast energy crisis of 2000, 2001?
Yeah, so I got to say, I before I came to this job, I litigated about that crisis.
As all energy lawyers did, right?
It's true. When I used to go to like an energy conference, I stopped doing this, but I should do it again, 5-10 years ago, whatever it was. And I would, just ask for a show of hands from the lawyers in the group as to who had litigated the energy crisis, and it was often like a third, half the room, or something like that. So I have my own perspective on sort of what happened, but at the end of the day, this was FERC's effort. FERC started open access transmission and encouraged utilities to come together and form these independent system operators, which are predecessors to the RTOs, and that all started in 1996 and didn't really get up and running in some parts of the country until 98, 99. And then in 2000, all of a sudden, the California market prices spike, and that lasts for basically a year intermittently, and there's power outages, and it's pretty bad from a number of different angles. And so I think for the parts of the country that had not yet started this restructuring process, this sort of caused them to slow things down or reverse course. And so this was sort of really bad timing for this market meltdown to happen. A lot of lessons learned. We don't have markets that are designed like that anymore. And from FERC's perspective, I think it became somewhat less aggressive in pursuing its agenda. It was going really hard about open access transmission, about forcing changes to how the utilities operated. And it went so far to even propose a sort of independent governance model in something called standard market design, but it got such pushback, including from Congress, that it just abandoned that effort. But it was winning in court on these big cases. It was pushing its agenda forward, and perhaps you could imagine sort of an alternate world where if the California crisis or Western energy crisis doesn't happen, FERC gets that standard market design agenda completed, and we have some sort of independent governance model across the country. But that's not what we have. And so we have sort of this real split where we have these RTOs, covering 2/3 of the load in this country, and the other third is just sort of run by the traditional utilities.
I'm glad you endorsed the thesis that the West Coast energy crisis was probably one of the major inflection points. I want to
you take pride in that?
No, it's just, and I just want to endorse the paper a little bit because reading through it, it does such a good job of navigating and explaining the dynamics through the orders, through the context of what was going on. So it's just an endorsement. It's a good summary because we actually had Catherine Blunt on, who wrote California Burning, who does this narrative of this period really well from the perspective of a utility. And I found your paper to be a good complement to that does the other side in a lot more detail around what was going on at FERC and how it impacted the governance structure of those RTOs. But it happened, and we got the circumstances we have today. And you have some reforms that you think would help kind of better set up our industry for meeting the challenges with innovation that is necessary to kind of deploy and meet the moment. Maybe I didn't want to use that term. We aren't going to cut it out because I don't want to do that to our poor producer, Sarah. But it was necessary to electrify everything to meet the electrification goals necessary to combat climate change. So can you talk a little bit about the reforms you're proposing and the way you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, the main problem I identify is that governance has stagnated, right? So as I mentioned earlier, these RTOs were set up by the utilities, starting in the late mid-late 90s. And the utilities often set them up in a way such that they would have certain influence. And so really it's not RTO governance, it's shared governance. So for example, in the PJM region, it's the utilities that have exclusive authority on regional transmission cost allocation. In other words, when we're going to build new transmission projects that bring benefits across the region, the utilities decide, not the RTO, how those projects get paid for. And that can really influence what gets built in the region. And so there's different sort of variations of that across the RTOs, some of them, not all of them. California's different, where the utilities have sort of formal control. And they also have informal influence. A lot of decisions get made through what are typically called sort of stakeholder processes, where we have committees of industry. Often the RTO staff as well participates very in detail in these processes as well, that basically come up with rule proposals for how the market's going to work, how transmission is going to be operated. And it's the board of directors of the RTO that has the sort of formal final say on all this. But like, that's a very weird role for a sort of corporate board to be able to have the authority to sign off on very detailed technical rules. It's not typically the way what corporate boards do. And so in practice, a lot of things are decided by market participants and staff. And so just my concern is that, again, we have these same utilities and some of the incumbent generators sort of still dedicated sort of fossil fuel technologies, which, you know, benefit from particular market structures. FERC has talked about this before. And so how do we make sure that we have an array of interests at the table, and in particular that we're setting up the market and transmission rules so that new technologies can succeed and that new parties can invest in the system. So I don't have sort of a one-size-fits-all solution, but that's sort of the goal, the main goal that I'm trying to achieve.
And before we get into your not one size fits all, but some of the solutions, can you talk a little bit about the origins of why some of these incumbent utilities, ended up getting these rights, even though at the time FERC was trying to be more efficient? I think it comes down to the filing rights and a decision by courts that the transmission owners had to retain filing rights. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the filing rights is basically who gets to put a proposal for new market or transmission rules before FERC. Because if the RTO is going to have a particular rule, it has to be approved by FERC. And this is a really important power because FERC sort of is very reactive. Its main task is to approve or disapprove proposals that it gets from industry. And only entities that have those rights can get their rules approved. And so you, as the entity with those rights, you really get to decide, are rules going to stay the same or are they going to change? And once you have those rights, you get to decide basically what the terms of the debate are before FERC. And rules just sort of subtly benefit particular technologies, particular parties. Even though rules have to be non-discriminatory, they're often beneficiaries, even identifiable beneficiaries from particular market changes. And so FERC's initial goal with the RTO was to say the RTO itself, that independent organization with its own staff, its own board, they get to have filing rights over everything, except for maybe how the utility sort of its own revenue requirement for its transmission assets. And the utilities went to court over that. And the court endorsed the idea that if you are a public utility under the Federal Power Act, which means you own or operate transmission, or you have certain rights under the Federal Power Act written in 1935, not written with a typical vertically integrated utility in mind, that FERC may not take away, but what the utility can do is decide to give up certain of its filing rights by contract, and that's what ended up happening. In order to make the RTOs happen, the utilities often handed over certain rights about writing the market rules or filing those market rules at FERC, and the utilities often retain certain rights for themselves. As I mentioned, in PJM, the utilities control regional cost allocation. And so FERC is in a position where even if it wanted to regulate a little more aggressively, there's this filing rights problem that it can't get around unless Congress changes the law. And just to give you one quick example of how this animates decisions today, we have a new regional transmission planning rule that FERC came out with a month or so ago. And one of the issues was what's going to be the role of state regulators. And Commissioner Christie and others said state regulators ought to be able to propose cost allocation rules because, as part of the planning process, it ought to be state regulators that have that authority. And FERC ultimately decided no, in part because of these filing rights issues that it didn't want to take on. So anyway, I asked for a rehearing on that issue. We'll see if FERC changes its mind, but this sort of filing rights issue continues to come up and ends up sort of determining who gets to make these important decisions.
So to say that a different way, because of this court decision that transmission owners had filing rights directly, it gave them leverage to negotiate governance structures for the regional transmission organizations in return for giving up that leverage and independent ability to set the terms of debate for FERC. Is that
yes?
That's the synthesis.
That's excellent summary.
Okay, it took me. Your paper helped me get there, and it is I think. Good explanatory value of how we got to where we are. You, it sounds like, are advocating that states should have, you would advocate that states should have something like a 205 filing right, that would give them more leverage to help negotiate governance structures. Is that?
I think we need to be bringing more parties into the governance process, and in part as a sort of mitigate the, I think, dominant control that incumbent players have. So I think states are sort of a natural party to bring into this. So yeah, I'm in favor of more formal roles for states like this.
And is that one of the reforms? I didn't see that in the paper, but that is a reasonable reform, maybe.
That's one of the things I put in the paper. It's probably only a couple sentences, but also respecting though that state regulators have their own full-time jobs, and so they can't be there every day working through the details of each market rule, but on big picture issues like, regional cost allocation that probably only comes up once every few years or something like that, it seems reasonable to me to give states a formal role there.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, because you do talk about the advantage of largeness in these processes. So if you have more subsidiaries, you can get more votes in subcommittees. If you have more staff, you can staff more subcommittees. And if you have a bunch of staff, but you just said PUCs, why can't they be big enough that they could staff this diligently? I actually think it's a core function of some of these, the importance of how the transmission system is operated, price formation protocols for a state's consumers seems to marry well with the role of a PUC in understanding and advocating for their interests in these regional organizations that ultimately we do have to get a regional consensus on how to do it.
There's one, you're getting at an issue that sort of animates this whole utility regulatory problem, which is resource constraints by regulators, right? So yes, I would love if state legislatures, doubled the budgets, but it's not just that. It's also hard for some of these state regulators to hire and retain people because they can go off and make more money working in industry. And so to bring in the best people and keep them is something that I think is challenging both for state offices and even sometimes for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as well.
Heard it's hard for public power utilities as well to get people and retain them. Getting back to your other reforms, so one would be state engagement in some of these market reforms and governance. You articulated a transparency principle. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I really just mean information sharing among market participants and the RTO, and making sure that nobody has privileged access to information. We're minimizing confidentiality. I think there's over secrecy in the industry sometimes. And this, just to give you one example, sometimes there was one issue that comes up time and time again is what to do with retiring assets like a coal-fired generator, what to do with their interconnection capacity, or what do we do to make up the supply shortfall when we have a big resource retire. And one thing that keeps coming up is just earlier notifications so that market participants can plan appropriately to replace that capacity, more ability to sort of auction off that interconnection capacity, and not just let the incumbent keep that capacity. And so some of the problems around this are just around when does the market participant have to tell other parties? Who does it have to share that information with? What are the study processes that happen after those announcements are made? And again, how can we bring in more market participants into that sort of process? So I just want more transparency around some of these issues. And it's just, it is a tough balancing act to sort of protect confidential business information, but at the same time, make sure that we really are having openness that sort of markets can take advantage of.
This hits home for me so closely, because I do think that information asymmetry for planning, if you actually want to do coordinated planning and have a more restructured grid where you have developers for generation that is a distinct business from transmission developers and investors that are different from electric service providers that understand the load needs, you actually need fairly robust sharing of information across those sectors to do planning adequately. Because right now, in our circumstances, we use the generator interconnection queue for transmission planning on where we need to plan. And there's something similar that has less, probably gets talked about less, which is a load interconnection process. So if large loads have to kind of interconnect and go through interconnection, and we use that for transmission planning too. And really coherent planning does require foresight into all three of those at once, so you can efficiently and effectively plan. So I like your transparency. It's hard because you do need abstraction, because there are commercial reasons that you could disadvantage yourself if for sales and stuff like that of assets, if you're telegraphing decades in advance. But yeah, and it's a reasonable policy goal.
Yeah, and I've seen instances where it's tilted in favor of the incumbents, these sorts of processes. And so, that's really what I'm trying to get across, is just more transparency for everyone else, not just the incumbents.
Right. So even as an incumbent, I don't have enough transparency, right? Because serving my load takes more than my transmission to serve my load efficiently, which is my goal, actually, cost effectively. So we had transparency. We have state regulators' involvement in the governance structure. I probably hacked that one up in a way that listeners can go rewind if they want how to describe that better. Anything else? Any other proposals or reforms?
I mean, I think it's just, we have so many new technology providers that didn't exist when these governance structures were created 25 years ago. And so just making sure that they're adequately represented. When PJM sort of created its governance structure, it put members into 5 different buckets, sort of based on traditional vertically integrated utility functions. So where does someone who has a dynamic line rating technology go? Where does somebody who wants to do sort of topology optimization go? And there's not really a home for those people. And storage can do, fit in a couple of different of those buckets, and where do they go? And so just making sure that governance structures are providing opportunities for all of these participants. But again, it's not a perfect. That's sort of a partial solution to the overriding problem of just sort of tamping down the influence of incumbents to make sure that these RTOs are continuing to innovate, even when it comes at the expense of the traditional business models and technologies.
And then the other element of the way of the paper is FERC could actually implement some of these reforms and the authority that it has, and how it could use those authority in innovative ways. Can you talk about how to incentivize through? Yeah.
So there's, again, the Western energy crisis comes back again to haunt us. One of the things FERC tried to do back in 2001 or so was to fire the California ISO board. And that led to a lawsuit. And the DC Circuit said that FERC can't fire a RTO board, because if it could fire an RTO board, what's the next step? It's going to fire the board of some privately owned investor-owned utility, and clearly FERC can't do that. So I think that's what the decision says. And so FERC has been sort of scared to act on governance, concerned that it's going to get struck down in court. And so my solution to that is to basically incentivize governance reforms. And one of the tools used to do that is something that FERC already does in its generator interconnection rules. And it's called the independent entity variation. And the idea is if you're an RTO and you don't directly own any, you don't own any generation, you have slightly different rules for processing the generation interconnection requests than a vertically integrated utility that has a financial interest in sort of unduly discriminating against its competitors. I think FERC could broaden this principle a lot more and say, look, if you meet our new independence criteria, whatever they might be, but FERC clearly can establish what it means to be independent and can add all sorts of different layers to that beyond what it's already done, and say, and if you meet those, here's how it's going to be easier for you to meet all of our rules going forward. Not just about interconnection, but about planning, et cetera. And of course, for the utility industry, you could throw in what Commissioner Christie calls FERC candy, which is, ROE incentives, or some other sort of, construction work in progress, whatever it might be, to sort of incentivize them to get this, to, sort of pursue this independence label. And so then, I think FERC, if it does that, I think that's a totally legal path forward for encouraging but not mandating governance reforms.
Throw in some FERC candy. That's a good tactic. I like that tactic. It's good. Doesn't work for public power, but then again, independence governance, I think makes a bunch of sense. Okay, I am going to ask in true podcast fashion, kind of the impossible question as a way to hopefully get some of your hot takes here. There was a recent report published in the that was salient to the West, authored by our friends at Grid Strategies, titled Market Configuration Matters. And then there's this quote, and it says, quote, studies conducted to date consistently demonstrate that, in fact, market footprint may be the most important consideration for consumers. So we know footprint matters. I think everybody acknowledges footprint matters. And it's always a question. And we did a whole episode themed after the Apple TV show Shrinking about how it's all about the vibes, about footprint, market design, and governance. So my question for you, in a game I'm calling Rank the Unrankable, can you rank order the importance of governance, configuration, and market design?
Wow. I mean, I'm biased towards governance, and I'll say if you get the governance right, then the right market design will follow from that, because you'll be putting in decision-making processes that will ultimately determine, shape that market design. And then, ideally the same thing would happen for scope as well. If you have the right decision makers at the top and the right set of rules in place, they'll be able to, I suppose that's a tricky one, but maybe they can induce other entities to become part of their well-governed system. But I do think without governance, you run the risk of, creating a cartel. That FERC regulation can shield utilities in some ways from certain types of claims, legal claims about antitrust, or at least the appearance. I think that sort of as a legal matter, that's not necessarily the case, but FERC regulation can, I think, provide a sort of seal of approval from a regulator that might shield from the public's view some monopolistic practices. I think, again, going back to this right of first refusal issue, in most industries, if companies carve up a geographic territory and give each other exclusive privileges and say they won't compete in those areas, you would run into an antitrust problem. When they do it through a FERC-regulated tariff, that makes it okay. So you have to be careful about governance, because, again, if you don't get it right, you'll just have incumbent companies sort of carving up the space for themselves, and you won't get all the benefits that would come with a well-structured market, regardless of its scope.
So you stick governance at the top, market design and configuration. You got to rank all three. You got the first one. We know your priority. I read it. I read your paper. I know your.
Yeah,
I know
right. I think I had to say governance here.
Yeah, I had to say governance.
Like I said, I think if you get the governance right, then you'll get an effective market design that will benefit consumers. So I think they almost like follow each other. I mean, scope clearly is important, particularly today, as we bring on more resources that really benefit from that greater scope. But I'll say if you don't have the right governance that's going to connect that scope, that in the right way, if we're not building transmission across sort of traditional territories, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of that bigger footprint. So you need governance to make sure that bigger footprint can operate coherently together.
I'm not settled on my opinion. I don't know how. It's an unfair question because I don't know how I'd answer it. But in the same paper, which I didn't share with you, and I doubt you've come across yet, but I do recommend it. It's a good paper. They reference this FERC decision to reject the Alliance RTO. It's this proposal I'm reading from, like a quote from the paper, a proposal by 9 Midwestern utilities to form this alliance. And they rejected it because the footprint wasn't coherent, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the rationale for FERC, but this was what it brought to me. I think you have a lot of examples where, because of the centrality of transmission for setting spot prices and setting economic dispatch and unit commitment based on optimal power flow, you can patchwork a footprint together that, even with great governance, would not have efficient operations or outcomes just because of the physics of the system. So from my perspective, the physics generally wins, and the footprint will define the physics for a transmission network. And you could end up with patchworks that will end up with phantom congestion, not because of the physics of the system, but because of the way the model thinks the system needs to operate because of the way the footprint is configured. Does that make sense? And what do you think of that?
I can't argue with physics.
You can.
I do think sometimes physics gets thrown up as just an obstacle for why we can't have innovation in some ways. But in this case, yeah, I mean, that's
not me. Don't accuse me of that.
No.
I think you can innovate within physics.
Yes. I didn't mean to accuse you. But that's a fair point. Patchworks are probably not going to work. And I commend you for bringing up the Alliance RTO proposal. That's a real deep cut into the FERC archives.
It wasn't me. It was in the paper. It was our friends at Grid Strategies. Yeah. A big fan of Rob. They dredged that one up, and I found it really insightful that actually it was an instance where FERC said, actually, this footprint is not coherent.
Yeah.
So we reject.
And it's one of the core factors that FERC was considering when it was reviewing RTO proposals, is the scope of the RTO. Its original vision was 4 RTOs covering the entire country. We didn't quite get there.
I loved in your paper, you have the different regions, and then it's just the West is this big mass of not an RTO except for an ISO. There are no RTOs in the West. There's just
technically,
an
yes,
system operator.
There is technically, I just use the term RTO because we have enough acronyms as it is. We don't need to say RTO/ISO every time. So I always just go with RTO, but technically New York and California are not RTOs because of this scope, this footprint issue. They only cover a single state, and the R is for regional. And so FERC said, no, you are still an ISO.
So for all of our energy wonks that listen to this podcast, if you ever get the question of what's the difference between an ISO and an RTO, now you've got
about it. Yeah.
The definitive answer. To pivot to we're trying to collect for our listeners different perspectives. And I want to just ask for your advice. What advice do you have for practitioners, researchers, policymakers, or electric utility enthusiasts like me who want to accelerate the energy transition? Do you have some quick advice?
Quick advice.
Or just advice. We got 9 minutes left. This ran long. My conversations always run long.
No, the people that I usually offer advice to are students, particularly law students.
I'm a lifelong student, Ari.
And one thing that I always encourage people to do is just find whatever the issue is that you think is really interesting, go deep on that issue. And the way that I go deep on an issue is docket diving, right? So you find whether it's a FERC docket, a Public Utility Commission proceeding, on whatever issue you think is most interesting, and read what everybody else is saying about it first to get yourself educated. What is the commission saying about it? What are the utilities saying about it? What are whoever else is participating in that proceeding? And to me, that's the best way to just learn about something efficiently.
And if you want to go deep on RTO governance, the paper does a great synthesis, and there's a lot of footnotes where you can follow the rabbit hole, follow your trail, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of nice and beautiful footnotes. So
take it deep dive.
Deep dive. Thank you so much. On this season, we're hosting an Energy System Analogies World Cup, because I do have one of the hosts is Farhad Billimoria, who lives in Australia. One of our other hosts, Conley Byers, who is at Harvard, but is currently currently on vacation, I think, in Zurich. And when we first talked to her, she was in Zurich. So it's a World Cup. That's my justification for it. And to do it, we're asking our guests whether they have an analogy they would like to submit to our field for contention in our World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, my go-to analogy is something I think might be too close to something that's already in there, but it's basically that the interstate transmission system is the central nervous system of the power system, in that it is sort of taking input as well as sending out signals to control this vastly interconnected system in the same way that your sort of nervous system extends out through your body to control your whole body. But if that one doesn't count, I brought a backup one just in case.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is you're endorsing Ahlmahz's analogy that the electric system is like the human body. So you should, if you have a second one, please bring it.
So my second one, I listened to your episode with Glick and Pamela Quinlan, and I think she made a Game of Thrones analogy, and I've never seen Game of Thrones, but I'm a big Star Wars fan.
Okay.
And so I was thinking about the paper that we've been talking about, and so I decided that this is going to be a deep cut for someone who's not a real Star Wars fan, but the electric utility industry is like the prequel era Jedi Council, and the Jedi had a monopoly on the Force. They had a monopoly on power, and one of the reasons for the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire is the sort of stagnation of the Jedi. How they became too comfortable in their old ways, too focused on just keeping things the way they were, and didn't see the changes happening around them that should have forced them to innovate. So that's, to me, how the electric utility industry is like the prequel era Jedi Council.
God, an indictment of Yoda. Really, that's harsh for a Star Wars fan. So if the electric utilities are like the Jedi, who's the Empire in this? Global warming? That's the Empire. Or not the Empire, but
listen, it's not a perfect analogy.
Not a perfect analogy. Okay. Well, I appreciate it. I like that we finally got a Star Wars analogy along with the Game of Thrones analogy. So thank you. I just hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. I really appreciate your time and your willingness to come talk about this wonky topic.
I appreciate the invitation. And I mean, I think this governance issue, to me, sort of infects everything. I would say, just I've listened to countless podcasts, webinars, read 100 white papers on transmission development. And when they don't discuss utilities and their role in all this, I get a little frustrated. So I appreciate you having me come on to share my perspective on all this.
And I appreciate the perspective, and I'll once again, the paper will be in the show notes. And I haven't yet read the prequel to this paper, which is the Utility Transmission Syndicate Forever. So just like the Star Wars prequels came after the originals in normal time, your prequel paper from 2021 will be a prequel to me, just like the Star Wars prequels.
And I'll see if one day maybe I'll complete my trilogy here.
Yes,
and come out with a third.
I'm very excited about it. Yes. Thank you so much. And back to Conley, Farhad, and Ahlmahz for more.
Energy Northwest is proud to provide clean, abundant, and reliable energy to help meet our growing needs. Energy Northwest is proudly advancing the Northwest's clean energy future.
I knew that.
Yeah, of course.
I knew that. They also have a great training program, which isn't in this promo, but I'll just provide it as a promo as well. They have a great internship program where college graduates can get an internship through Energy Northwest. I've talked about it many times on this podcast. I'm a big fan of that program. Wasn't in this ad read. They didn't write it in, but I'm just inserting it because I'm such a big fan.
All right. Well, sign up, boys and girls. Learn more about nuclear energy and its full potential at energy-northwest.com. That's energy-northwest.com.
We're back with Ahlmahz and Farhad. I'll start with you, Farhad. What stuck out to you in the conversation? Where would you like to get started?
I think overall, again, that was a very, very wonky conversation. But what struck out to me here is the particular challenge of reform together with decarbonization in the US relative to, and taking an external perspective here relative to other jurisdictions. And I think some of the complexities that I'm also just becoming aware in terms of the US system relate to, I guess, the incumbent governance framework and the interaction with the sort of federalism idea and the distinction between states and the federal government, as well as the interaction with the laws at each of those levels. And I learned a lot on that. But it seems like just this inordinately complex beast because you've got so many different layers and so much prior sort of incumbent theory and doctrine that it's hard. You've got to sort of unpick at the edges really and pulling down these little structures that preserve either inappropriate or uncompetitive behavior from these licensed monopolies. I'm
glad you're teasing on that point because I come back to this over and over again in thinking about the energy transition. So much of the way we regulate our industry is like based on this like heuristic of how it works. And like the theory of how we regulate this one institution because of how it works in relationship to this other institution. But as you kind of pull the thread of like, actually, we aren't going to install a bunch of conventional power plants anymore with, synchronous generators that are frequency supporting. We're going to have a lot of incentives for a different energy mix. Some of these, like the threads unwind. And if you're starting from that whole cloth of what was a doctrine and a theory that was coherent, but you've teased apart some things that make it coherent, you just start losing the coherence. And it is a mess for in the US.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like in some degrees it is in every jurisdiction, but there are particular. I kind of look at it as a sort of grand Coasian bargain. When we look at what Coase wrote about reform, the sort of the transaction costs of getting from one state to another. I guess his ultimate conclusion was on a theoretical level. It doesn't matter where you allocate. It doesn't matter who gets the property rights for in terms of managing an externality, and participants will negotiate a way to kind of to internalize that externality. Here, the externality, I guess, being inappropriate regulation and incentives. But it's interesting that in that whole process of changing regulation, there were certain bargains struck. And ROFR was one of them. There's probably a whole heap of other ones that are sort of buried in there that are quite, and especially for the utilities that currently are not liberalized in terms of the sort of market frameworks in the ISO or RTO regions. There are some pretty big rights that have sort of stuck around that make regulation and good governance challenging. Because ultimately, I think following the money of how folks actually make returns, how companies make returns, how executives make returns, those regulatory frameworks matter. And so it was. I actually quite enjoyed your discussion around what's a good governance structure? How does public power integrate into that? If someone comes in with a sort of a non-profit, not-for-profit motivation or a corporate objective, does that change the dynamic, or do we still look at it as, well, there are even though it's not for profit, there are, funds flow and monetary incentives at play. So I thought that was a really good discussion.
What did you think about the Grand Kosian bargain, Ahlmahz? Do you know what a Grand Kosian bargain is?
I do not. But I think that Farhad dropped the ended right where well, what stood out most to me was that question about public ownership of transmission assets. And I know you directly asked him about that, and I didn't quite get what his opinion was on that, and whether or not public ownership of transmission does make a difference in any of his viewpoints on what's currently wrong with transmission today. So that is something that stood out to me, mostly because probably I'm a little bit biased in this area. I actually do believe that transmission is one of those things that should be, excuse me, not owned by a particular utility, but should actually be a public asset, a public good. And maybe the piecemealing of trying to introduce competition into a natural monopoly has sort of made it a mess right now, and made it kind of weird. And maybe it's not necessarily it's a mess right now. Maybe we're still in the process of figuring out. This is a decades-long process of figuring out exactly what should be public and what should be private, where there should be competition, where markets are better, and where perhaps government intervention is best. So this conversation that you had with Ari just really brought out those thoughts that I have about public ownership of assets and grid assets.
Maybe to pose something to both of you, because you're both from public power, right?
That's right.
And I've been at a public market operator, or this sort of, the Australian model is actually quite interesting because it's part public, part private. So it's a kind of like a joint venture between public and private. So obviously there's really important functions that a utility has in a region that are related to safety, maintenance of the lines, those sorts of things that require a lot of focus, and sometimes not having that push of, what's the right dollar amount that you need, and that sort of real laser focus on costs might be a good thing. The other side of the thing, I guess, is how do you look at the innovative aspect, the innovation aspect? That was something that I know that you talked about with Ari, but for both of you, are there actually incentives to innovate at public power? How does it work? How does someone come up with a good idea and bring it through the channels? And how does management react to something which doesn't really affect anyone's bottom line, but affects the good of the stakeholders, good of customers? How does it all work in real life?
So I'll start, Paul, and then you can jump in because I'm excited about this one. I think you just said it in the answer was in your question, right? So for us, our number one is our community, our customers. So to the extent that you can innovate in a way that improves the lives of your customers, that's always welcome. At least at Tacoma Power, that's always welcome. But also a lot of the innovation has to do with the people themselves. You hire into the organization innovative people, they're going to innovate. And so, yes, you will have some pockets in any organization where, people who want to just do things the way they've always been done. But I would say that Tacoma Power has done a fantastic job of hiring innovative people who like to think differently and do things differently. And so to the extent that we can innovate, we do. We do have restrictions on things like gifting of public funds, and we can't just go throwing money around, and we do have some restrictions on how we can spend money. But that's a lot of times where our creativity comes from, is like we have those constraints on us. but we still try to innovate to find ways to do things better for our customers. It's just that there's still innovation. It's just the goal is no longer profits. The goal is for people.
Beautiful answer, Ahlmahz, as expected. And I do think when you hire innovative or creative people, you end up with innovative or creative organizations. I would add, I think we a lot of times have a skewed innovation paradigm. And by skewed, I mean on our incentive structure, to your point, like we aren't motivated for the profit, but we are actually motivated not to increase costs. So because we have this like direct responsiveness to and sensitivity to the rates that we charge, we are more incentivized to innovate to reduce costs of service, and we aren't as incentivized to innovate to expand services. And I think you can actually see some of that in electric vehicle charging, in sort of electrification paradigms, because there is an indication that maybe you can provide what would be a value-added service to your customer by displacing their other fuel supply. But to do that, you may have to increase your rates. And we do have a resistance to that because we're skewed in our innovation to things that would decrease our rates, not necessarily decrease our customers' overall spend. And some of that is just in framework. And that is something I think Ahlmahz and I are trying to like push back on and say, hey, actually, we can innovate in ways that is to the betterment of our customers writ large, instead of just innovating for purposes of reducing cost or reducing energy rates or reducing electricity, and maybe even starting to be clear about, I'm talking about electricity rates, not energy rates, and electricity cost, not energy cost. But if electricity is your source of energy and I can reduce your overall energy cost, that is to your benefit. That's where, I do think there are a lot of institutions within public power that are great at innovations. Cooperatives are excellent institutions at innovation and finding. They're maybe a little bit more able to look for expansion of services in ways that municipally owned or like public utility districts can't innovate to expand of services.
A spirited defense of public utilities, which I think that, and I did see this sort of similar mentality when I worked for the Australian market operator, in that the level of innovation, there was an element of public service associated with it. And so it's, in some ways, the incentives are similar to maybe any other public service, or, for example, when you look at the way that a military works, right? There are no necessarily any sort of, for folks serving in that capacity, monetary incentives, and those are sort of put to the side, and it's really about this idea of service to the community. And I guess there's an important aspect of incentives and game theory around that too, right? I think that's also a really important. There is an economic good associated with that too. So to me, that is also a really interesting model. Of course, what we've tended to talk about most through this show is a sort of competitive power, especially on the generation side. But I think transmission and distribution is a really interesting one, because, and I guess we're going to talk about it with Lynn at some point, is this idea of common pool resource, that it's something which affects all of us. It's not something like which can be something that then can be traded with similar commodification. It's something that when you do something in transmission, especially in the way electricity flows, me building a line here is going to affect everyone in the system. So there's, I think, a good discussion to be had around incentives for public power too, particularly I think for T&D, or transmission and distribution. I think there is a lot to consider, and to me, the contrast between the the corporate or the privatized model of transmission distribution versus public power? I think that is a really interesting question. That's one area which I probably haven't made a firm call on yet, and I think there's arguments both ways.
I think that's the future. At least that's what I'm hoping. I see that as a potential to really revolutionize it's how we're going to get to the point where we can have a just distribution of costs of our energy system. So I know there are different when we all have different definitions of what just might be, but from my definition of what it means to be just, that includes everybody being able to have access and afford electricity. And just when I just look at I make predictions or watch other people make predictions of the costs of decarbonizing our grid, I know it's going to be hard on a large segment of our population. And anyway, it doesn't feel just to me. So for me, it feels like the future of how we allocate costs and build transmission. And so anyway, that's my prediction right there.
Well, I want to get back a little bit to the Ari interview, and I think the segue here is around his view around innovation and efficiency and how regulation of institutions like regional transmission organizations is really important to make sure it has a governance structure that allows for innovation. I want to get back to your point a little bit earlier, Farhad, about the filing rights and the way that kind of this current structure grew out of the prior frameworks, and Ari's point that I synthesized, I think, around some institutions were granted a 205 filing right at FERC because of their ownership of transmission. And I gave a bargaining chip when negotiating the governance structure of our transmission operators, and the need a little bit to maybe give somebody else some bargaining chips as well, so that they have a chance to also get closer to procedural justice. Anything on that conversation, or to follow up on your point, Farhad, around the way that these regional institutions have to reflect larger footprints policies rather than public power represents the interests of our local people, and the regional, to be efficient and innovative at a regional scale, the institutions that reflect those priorities need to also have a juster governance structure.
I think the question of footprint and scope, which you then dived into, is a really interesting one. And again, I guess while all of these institutions are technically not-for-profit or some framing of that corporate structure, what I do tend to notice sometimes is that there does seem to be an aspect of competition, especially when it comes to scope and expanding footprint, because the idea seems to be that a larger RTO, to use the proper framing, or the proper definition, the larger an ITO, and potentially also the more contiguous it has, the better you can get scheduling and economic dispatch to reflect what the optimal power flow should be. But there's also this broader sort of influence or scale issue of, if I have just more customers everywhere, maybe I tend to be a larger ISO or larger RTO, and I can do more, or I can just have more influence or be more powerful. And I guess my question is that also an incentive for folks? I know there was a big battle between two of the RTOs around the Midwest region, and a bunch of utilities went with SPP versus, was it
MISO?
MISO, okay. So that almost seemed like a sort of almost like a competitive tender, and there's sort of this battle for folks, battle for utilities moving into into one customer RTO fold or the other.
Yeah, well, a version of that is currently playing out in the West too. SPP and the California Independent System Operator both have day-ahead markets, and that has been, I don't know, a competitive offering out here, which may be an undercurrent throughout the entire interview with Ari, is that sort of dynamic. And obviously, the bigger the RTO, it's similar to utilities, where the more customers you have, the broader you can spread some of the fixed administrative costs of managing the network. Same is true for regional transmission organizations. That the more customers you have, the architecture, the corporate structure, you can spread those costs wider. I actually wanted to dig into, because this is an area that I find fascinating, and I brought it up with Ari. I'd love to get both of your takes. The Alliance RTO got cited in a recent paper that Grid Strategies put out as an example of a footprint that FERC rejected because it had no coherence. Like, it wasn't a coherent footprint. It was just a spattering, a patchwork of utilities that wanted to get together, and they rejected it because the footprint didn't really make sense. And my hypothesis, my ongoing, I don't know, I wouldn't call it advocacy, but when I talk to people about footprints, what I think matters the most is the physics of the footprint. And one concern I have about footprints of regional transmission operators is whether they become patchworks, to which point your congestion does not reflect the actual transmission physics of the system, but reflects the limited transmission that you offer within that OPF calculator, because it can't dynamically, or that optimal power flow can't dispatch or understand generation outside the footprint. It's just within the footprint. I would love if either of you have thoughts on that. It is one of my ongoing concerns about footprints of regional transmission organizations.
I don't actually, well, I probably should have let Farhad say something first, because my thing is, I don't actually know if physics is at a consideration at all in the development of the existing RTOs that we have right now. Was that even a consideration? I'm going to guess no.
Well, the Alliance RTO is one where FERC said that can't do it because of the physics. But the other ones was like, oh, this passes my test. That's okay. Like, it's okay. That's how I interpret it.
Okay. Well, I'll let Farhad jump in there, because that to me, so this is just my skeptical self saying there must have been another reason why FERC denied that. In addition to the, physics might have been just a reasonable excuse that could be used and to justify it. But then that doesn't, like, I've never heard of like that in the development of our existing RTOs, the footprint had to be based on some sort of physics that made sense. Because I've never heard of that. It makes me suspicious about that being the reason for this one right here. I could be wrong.
Well, we talked about OPF. You described it as the maestro of an orchestra. Like, even if it wasn't the actual real one, it's a real concern, right? Your dispatch is really dependent on your footprint.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're trying to optimize around the physical system, which means that you're considering flows in and out of your different transmission components and in and out of different generation and into sinks, consumption sinks, your network model really matters. So
yes,
if you've got some resources in one region and some in a totally non-contiguous region, or I often wonder how in Australia, we've got the simplicity of the national electricity market that just at the moment, it's just all in one market on the eastern seaboard. And then we've got a few other sort of little grids around. But the benefit of having a centralized clearing across all of those regions is, I don't think we appreciate that until we actually look at a market like the US, because I often wonder how you do that in that situation. I do know like that the California Independent System Operator, for example, has a contiguous region, and then there are spots where there's almost islands of clearing, and there then you're integrating with your physical networks out of that region are to maybe the neighboring utility. And so then you've got this interaction between two different forms of market clearing regulation. It's great for me to say, well, it's optimal for this region to have this particular supply mix, but what's happening around the edges? What is ensuring that the power flow that determines a transmission injection from that region to another is actually being enforced in that other region? So the boundary conditions, I think, really matter. And yeah, I do. I as an engineer, I do think the physics matter a lot. That doesn't, and I guess to your hierarchy question, it probably depends on which one you put at the top of governance versus market design. And what was the third one? Was scope, right?
Was like footprint. Like, footprint, yeah, what's your footprint?
So it's which, if you're someone that really respects the physics, maybe it's footprint at the top. But that the question would be, well, what's a better outcome in that situation? And it sounds like keeping them in that current utility governance. FERC decided, well, that's not, we don't see the benefit to actually moving over to an RTO when it's just not even a contiguous or an understandable topology that would actually benefit in terms of the tools that we've got of optimal power flow and economic dispatch.
Okay, from the doctorate from Oxford in engineering, footprint matters. I think is what I heard. What about you, Ahlmahz? Where are you at on this? Where would you hierarchy? What's your hierarchy as a doctorate in electrical engineering from UW?
So here's the thing. All of those matter. So the question is just what's most important to you. And if you are if you feel like, and I'm assuming that this group of utilities that got together and wanted to make it RTO is because they didn't feel like they were being represented in whatever way, whatever. I have no idea who Alliance RTO is and what their footprint looked like, but they must not have felt represented in their status quo. So for me, if you're looking at procedural justice, if you're looking at ensuring that there's that your voice is heard, governance goes at the top. And that might mean a footprint that doesn't look like, what would be ideal, if you prioritize physics. But the physics is going to happen. Like, you're not going to, it's not like physics laws cease to exist because you have a wonky looking footprint, right?
This is what I'll say to close it out. I think I get the final word on this, okay, as the producer and today's host. I think, to Ari's point about how incumbencies can maintain an advantage even within RTOs, one such way is to generate a patchwork of transmission operation around their own service territories. Because if you develop a patchwork and you're the only one, and congestion within your service territory is reflected on your boundaries, and your economic dispatch of your generation is just within your transmission and network boundaries, you effectively maintain the status quo operations, maybe a little bit more efficient because the computer is doing this hourly instead of your operators doing it based on a heuristic. But it is effectively a way to maintain status quo. And so I think that is a reason why FERC could say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to maintain effectively an inefficient dispatch just around your own existing network. And I don't want to say I didn't research Alliance RTO. that's what they did, or that's why I think Ahlmahz, you're really insightful. Maybe it was for some other reason. But I do think, as I view it, as I think about this problem, that is clearly a way to maintain status quo, but have a signal of advancement.
And as we've seen, sorry to destroy your last word, Paul, but as we've seen,
your last word's better than my last word. 10 out of 10 times. Same with Ahlmahz. Go ahead.
I was just saying, these decisions matter. Once things are done, it's hard to undo it. So in some ways, I guess that's also the other thing is, okay, you may think, oh, well, this is a nice interim step, and maybe there's some better coordination that'll happen down the track. But sometimes once a decision's made, it's actually, this might be the thing for the next 20 or 30 years, because it's so hard to undo decisions or move the dial forward. So sometimes no decision might be better than making the decision or deferring it.
You want a chance for a last word, Ahlmahz?
Nope.
Let's hit the typewriter and close it out. We are skipping the World Cup standings for this week because both Ari's interview was long and then our conversation about Ari's interview is long. So we're cutting it. We got too much other content for this week. Ahlmahz, I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated.
Every single day.
Farhad, I hope you feel like you belong. I hope you feel appreciated in getting up so early on a Tuesday morning.
Nothing I'd rather do.
To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Roll on, enthusiasts. Roll on. Before the edits, or before the credits, some breaking news. You're the first to hear it. If you stuck around, we are doing a season finale and likely a series finale to close out Public Power Underground August 25th. Save the date. It'll be in person in Kalama, Washington. If you're a friend of the Underground, I'm not going to share my address on the internet, but let me know. It will be in person. It will be fun. There will be a concert. I'll send out more information on Substack in the future, but August 25th, we're doing our season finale, which will include the ESSA World Cup Championship. And we're going to do what is likely a series finale to close out Public Power Underground. So if you are a friend of the Underground, which you definitely are because you stayed to now after all of this, August 25th, you know you're invited because you're a listener. Reach out to me, get the address, get the invite. Family-friendly environment will be at the Hobbit Hole, and there will be a great concert and plenty of food, plenty of fun for families. So save that date. I hope everyone's excited. Because you stuck around, you got the first word of it. So thank you very much. Now for the credits.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts.
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, S&P Global, News Data, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery, Ahlmahz Negash, Conley Byers, and Farhad Billimoria, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiasts, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.